everybody. Welcome to another episode of the original IntersexConnect Live. I'm your host, Jesse Benedict, and I'm so glad you came to join us today to watch this very important episode. Before we get on to our guest today, I always have a comment. And Leah Thomas has been in the news, the NCAA swimmer, a lot since our last episode. And I just wanted to make a comment that unless you can say this is the science that the NCAA used, and this is why I think it's flawed, we really don't have anything to talk about. So we're going to move on to today's guest. This is going to be a very interesting show because if you're an intersex person, you've tried to get mental health care of any kind, you've probably found it very difficult. I have biases against the mental health community that have absolutely nothing to do with intersex. So I'm going to try and keep all my life bias out of this conversation as best I can. So today we have Dr. Cynthia Mulit, actually Cynthia Jackson Mulit, PhD, LPC, NCC, BC, TMH. And we're going to get into what all that means in a little bit. But Dr. Mulit, as an executive director, before she became a counselor, she was an executive director for nonprofits, and she received tons of awards, not only at the local level, the state level, but at the federal level as well. She even received recognition from not only the U.S. Department of Commerce, but even the White House themselves. Since then, Dr. Mulit has become an intersex ally who dedicated her counseling career to increasing the number of competent intersex counselors. Amen, we need that. In her dissertation, Intersex Experiences, Activists, Intersex Experiences, Activists, Perspectives, and Counseling Implications, Dr. Mulit set forth a model to describe how some intersex individuals develop a healthy identity despite the oppression. Dr. Mulit is creating a positive impact by providing information and training through mass media. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Cynthia Jackson Mulit. Dr. Mulit, how are you this morning?
I'm doing really well, and thank you for such a nice welcome. And it's an honor to be here. And I have to say that I've been so impressed with how hard you and Vash work to put on this program that it's truly an honor to be here.
Well, thank you so much for saying so. I'm going to take a quick moment to recognize Robert and Ronnie, and thank you both so much for joining the show. We're very glad to have you as a guest. And so the first question I ask anybody on this show is, are you intersex?
So is that directed at me first?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. First of all, I want to just a little clarification. The easiest way to remember my name is by the bad hairdo mullet. So it's actually mullet, not mullet, multi.
Oh, okay. See, I was making you a superhero because I had to keep changing it because I kept saying Multi Jackson because you've done so much. There must be more than one of you. But it's mullet. I will get that correct from this point.
Like the hairdo.
I should have asked sooner. Hi, Janet. Oh. Anyway, so
I am not intersex. In fact, if you want to talk about least likely, I probably fit in that category because I'm a cisgender woman, heterosexual, and so I just my background is fully did I say intersex? So I'm fully an ally in every way.
That's awesome. So how did you actually hear about intersex the first time?
So it wasn't that long ago. I mean, given my lifespan, I was in my the final semester of my counseling master's class, and that's a second career for me. So my first career was in nonprofit management, and I was looking for something more one-on-one. So I decided that counseling would be something I could do one-on-one rather than have so many community meetings. And so I went back in my late 50s to get my master's in counseling, which you do to get licensed. And I was in, as I said, I was in my last semester in a required class called Sexual Issues. And if intersex is going to be presented in our curriculum, and it's pretty formulaic, counselors have a pretty full schedule of required courses. it's going to be in the sexual issues class. And it did come up in my sexual issues class. And when my professor told me the story of Cheryl Chase, I was dumbfounded. And it was a moment that it changed my life. I mean, I thought, no, this is America. I listened to PBS. Surely I would know if this was happening. How come I'm just learning about now? So one thing, I thought I would know it if it was happening in the US. And then
as an intersex person, I can totally relate to that, because I didn't even know about intersex until I was in my late 40s. And it's like, I'm sorry, this is my own body, and I don't know about this.
Yes,
so
yes.
I know the shock.
It was shock.
All right. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So if you don't mind, we're going to move on. First of all, we'll say hi to Dorian and Alexander, just spelled differently. Sorry. Hi, Alexander. Hi, Dorian. Anyway, before we go on, because a lot of people tell me, and I've been probably told other people, that the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist is one can prescribe medications and one can't, and that's all there is. But that's not true. Could you please help me figure out the differences between all the different letters that come behind the name, so that I know who the heck I'm talking to?
Sure. It's really an important question, because the treatments that intersex people will receive depend upon the different fields of mental health. So first of all, a PhD means that person has had years of training in the mechanics of research. So that's a research-oriented degree. Do you want to go on, or do you want me to talk in general about the four fields? Or do you want me to talk?
Yeah, we're just going to touch on them as much as you think that we need to know, because you give me an in-depth understanding and I'll forget by the next question. So just a helicopter view, please.
LPC means licensed professional counselor, which means that I am recognized by a state, in my case, the state of New Jersey, to be able to provide counseling to people without needing to be supervised on a weekly basis. So I've done all of that training, and I'm now no longer in need of supervision. And if I were in need of supervision, my license would be LAC, as in licensed associate counselor. That's not the same. That's not the same in every state. So, for example, an LAC is actually the full license in the state of Illinois. So it's, you have to be careful as to which state you're talking about. But for New Jersey, I have the highest license. I can practice unsupervised.
Okay. And then what do we got next?
So lately there was a sense of needing a credential in our field, in the field of counseling, to show that the individual knows counseling in a broad way, the same way in California as in New York. And so there's a very big test that we take if we want that credential, and it's called the National Counseling Credential. And so I have taken that national test. It's a national certified counselor, excuse me. And it just says that I've taken that test. And so I'm recognized at having a very broad level of expertise, not just a state specific level of expertise.
Awesome. That's amazing. Oh. To me, it is anyway.
More and more counseling is turning to the internet, Zoom counseling sessions. Mm-hmm. And that then runs into all kinds of issues that aren't present if you're just practicing within one state. So this is a board certified telemental health credential that I have, which means that I studied and passed tests that help me become proficient in understanding what it means to provide counseling when I may be providing counseling across state lines. Wow.
So kind of like this show here, because we're talking to people all over the place. We got Sheila Anna and joining us as well. But so you are not only our guest, but you're a certified guest that has the ability to talk on a national level and international as well at this point. So, all right, was that all of them? I think it is. Okay. Yes. So, all right, now I want to get into the down and dirty about counseling and intersex, and I don't hear a lot of good things. When we were talking the other day, you mentioned something to the effect that intersex counseling at this point is in the dark ages. Could you expand on that for me?
So the way I think about that is I'm wearing two hats. One I'm thinking about that question as how a client would experience it, and then the other hat I am thinking about is how I, as a counselor educator, think about that. What when I think about what it means to not be in the dark ages as a counselor educator, that's one answer. And when I think about what the client themselves is experiencing, then I think about it another way. So let me talk about the client first.
Okay.
So if an intersex person goes into a counseling situation and they have to spend the bulk of their hour educating the counselor, that's a problem to me. Counselors are providing a paid service, and they shouldn't be training the counselor in the context of that, that session. So there's that. But then there's also the harm that could happen. So if a counselor really makes an assumption, let me just give an example of an assumption. If a counselor makes the assumption that every single intersex person is exactly the same, and maybe they've read one article about intersex and they think that they now know it, that can harm by ignorance.
Oh boy.
What often happens that I've noticed in the counseling textbook is that we don't devote a lot of real estate, in other words, pages, to teaching about intersex. And so we are combining intersex and trans. And I think that that's giving the impression that that intersex people are exactly the same thing as trans, or trans is exactly the same thing as intersex, and it's not.
Yeah,
so,
we have that same problem with the medical community as well, as far as getting competent healthcare.
So I think that there's a lot of very ignorant counseling that's happening. And when I ask myself, why is that happening? That's my counselor educator hat that comes on and says, it's because counselors aren't being trained. And I know what's happening in the sexual issues class. I know what the textbooks look like. I know what really good research looks like for sexual minorities. So let me give an example. So if I was a gay man looking for good counseling service, I would go to a counselor who would have expressed that they're qualified, that they felt competent, and they would have read about being gay coming out, being gay in school. There would have been research articles on what it means to be gay and Black, what it means to be a gay man getting older, what it means, health issues. There would be so many research articles that it would have been written that when the individual came to the session, the counselor would feel fairly aware of of major issues in that community. But counselors aren't getting that training. So I know that they're not going into those sessions with that level, that level of understanding that other sexual minorities, they have a body of research that intersex people just don't have yet. It's just not
right.
There.
It's kind of sad, isn't it? So, but you have actually been working to change that, right?
Yes. When I ask myself, well, why is that happening? It's taken me a while to sort of come to some understanding as to why that situation might happen. And I think that there's some things to be said about the intersex community that are factors in that. And I think that there are things to be said about the counseling community that's a factor of that. So counselors or anybody in the mental health. Could I back up and talk about the different tracks of mental health?
Sure.
So I'm a counselor educator, but counseling is my field. I'm an educator of counselors, but there's a difference between counselors and social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists. Those are all mental health professionals. And we have our own major association, like, for example, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Counseling Association, and our parent organization polices us and sets ethic guides and trains, participates in ongoing yearly training. So how I think about the differences between those tracks is where we think the problem is. So a psychiatrist is going to look at a client and think that the problem is in their body, their chemical makeup. A psychologist is going to think that the problem is in the individual's mind, and a counselor might expand, and we tend to think of people as basically well, and so we might be looking into the community and say, well, maybe there are community reasons why a person is depressed. So we don't tend to, as a field, and this is general, counselors tend to be not oriented towards seeing human beings as disordered as a first line of explanation of where the problems are, but rather look at the culture and say, you know, what might be stressing that individual as a result of the culture that they're in, and how can we facilitate, you know, a healthy or improved interaction in the environment that they're in. So
I have to interrupt you, sorry, because this question came up and it's not one that I told you I was going to ask you.
Sure.
In the counseling world, do they use the word intersex or DSD? Because the medical community will only use DSD and they won't use intersex.
To the extent that counselors are aware, we would align with sociology and not want to be using DSD. Again, I'm speaking very generally, but because of our orientation to seeing people as basically well, as a field, as a general sense of my sense of our field is that we aren't comfortable diagnosing, and we aren't that comfortable seeing people as disordered. So we most definitely are not inclined to look at people as disordered and see that labeling people is part of the process. So we see that all of that psychiatric labeling kind of inhibits a person feeling really good about themselves. So no, I would say that, first of all, there isn't that much research. So there's that aspect. But counselors are more aligned with sociologists than they are with doctors that diagnose, or surgeons that are treating and labeling intersex people as DSD.
Okay. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Well, no, I think that's a very germane aspect to understanding that depending upon who an intersex person goes and seeks help from, they're going to get a certain kind of treatment. So right. It's very important to know that I'm coming from a certain background, and it's not the same as psychologists, who, by the way, are the mental health professionals or social workers that are typically found in DSD clinics. I've never seen one of the children's hospitals hire a counselor. So the people that are oriented toward wellness, I'm not sure are represented in the places where intersex people are being labeled DSD.
Well, they're not, because the medical community wants disorder to be a scary word for parents, and they also use normalization surgery, the word that just makes my skin crawl, and the normalization surgery is also a word to scare people, to let them think that their child is not normal. All right. So anyway, if you could, do you remember where we left off and before I interrupted you?
Yeah. So I wanted to go a little bit more into why counselors aren't being trained, and talk about the reasons that may be intersex related and communities related, and that may be counseling communities related. First of all, there has to be the research that then is put into the textbooks, that the textbooks are then training the counselors. So where is the research? The problem in getting a lot of research that are targeted toward intersex is that counselors don't have an easy way to enter the intersex communities. First of all, counselors like to think of themselves as the good guys. In the intersex community, with the legacy of Dr. Money, we are not the good guys. He was a psychologist. So I don't introduce myself to an intersex person and say I'm a mental health professional and expect them to go, oh, great, wonderful, welcome. It hasn't been like that. It hasn't been like that at all. So I think that there is a suspicion that we have to overcome, and nobody wants to be rejected. So at a personal level, I can say that it's been uncomfortable for me a lot of times to feel welcome to do research. I feel like I always have to climb this extra barrier. Am I really caring? Am I going to harm? Am I going to somehow? I think one of the ones that I've had is, oh, you're going to make money somehow off of intersex knowledge. And so I think that's been a barrier.
Right.
But then also counselors, if you look at who's typically doing the research, I'm not typical, because a lot of the research is being generated by young counselors who are, new in their profession. They're probably starting a family. They need to get published so that they can get tenure. They need to find a topic that they can get in, do the research, get out, get lots of articles in their, So the fit that, when you look at the subjects that get a lot of research in counseling, it's because they're easy ones. So if the intersex community really wants to have the kind of research that can come from counselors, and we don't see intersex people right off the bat as disordered, then there needs to be more of a facilitation of how that research can happen. So my nonprofit hat, from my former career, would wish for a organization that would be run by membership vote, an intersex mental health organization, and all of the members voted, and they would have a organized way that a researcher could approach them and say, here's my proposal. And they could say, great. Have you read this book, this book, this book? But, they could test me for competence, and they could point me in the direction of where I could get subjects. And then after I do my work, they could read it and decide to stamp it as helpful and not harming or not. So there would be a supervision level of what came out of my work.
So basically peer-reviewed work is what you're saying.
From the intersex community, but from the intersex, not from counselors. There would be that layer on top of it later. But initially, so that I could come in and maybe I would want to do an article on intersex and in the school, or intersex in the age. And by the way, the additional complexity is that counseling is not going to be one thing for all intersex people. All the variations are so different that, important counseling for an AIS woman who discovers late in life that, that she has an intersex variation is very different from hypospadias or people who are presenting with, early in life. So there's going to have to be all of that research by variation. So I go back to the dark ages, we have to have so much research that we just aren't there yet. And my dream is one day that, of course, that we have more, and it's more organized and systematic. And I want to talk about assets and danger. The danger
before you go into the assets and dangers, I just want to give a shout out to Alexis and Tammy. And let's see, there was a comment here. Alexis is going to the gender clinic in the UK. So representation around the planet today. Anyway, please go on about, you were talking about the harm. Is that right?
Yes.
Dangers.
But I want to comment on seeing Alexis' name, and what I'm talking to be a further qualifier of what I'm talking about counseling is that I'm talking about it from a U.S. perspective. So now add, the services that may vary in the UK compared to, or any other country compared to the US. So each country will have have different research opportunities, and the pictures may evolve somewhat different depending upon the different countries that are doing the research. So I wanted to just go back and talk about what I think has improved since I first since this first became my passion. I think that the amount of work that's been going on in the last 10 years with activists is just astounding. I mean, it's heartwarming and inspiring to see, intersex activists, really trying to reach out to other people who are in pain and get the knowledge out, and the memoirs that have been coming out and the media that's been coming out. So the more that intersex people are courageous and tell their stories, the more people like myself, who may not learn about it in our sexual issues class, might hear it on a TV program and go, what is that? And start our own education process. So I've seen a tremendous amount of work in that regard.
That's great, because I always say the more people talk about it, the more people are going to hear about it. And the more people hear about it, the more people they'll tell. And It's like an old shampoo commercial or whatever, but yeah. So yes, getting people out there and talking about it, and if we can get people that are beyond the intersex, the not intersex people, to talk about it and share it as much as possible, that would be great, because I spend way too many hours battling on the internet in conservative groups and religious groups and trying to educate them. And it's amazing that quite a few people are open to it once they hear about it and they see that there's actual information, and that they have something to actually believe in because it's real information, as opposed to what they've been taught over their entire lifetime about sex being binary and that religion is against intersex and all that, because none of that is true. So
that's an important issue, as to, or it reminds me of an important issue, which is what really is the basic knowledge that counselors need to have. When should we consider counselors competent? What do they know? And in my view, counselors are going to have some basic biology understandings of human sex development. They're going to have at least a few variations, so that they understand that there's wide diversity in the intersex community. For example, hypospadias, PAIS, AIS, CAH, Klinefelters. I mean, I think if they could get some understanding of the top most common ones, that would be helpful. I think that they also need to understand the history of intersex treatment over the years, because for many centuries, it was accepted, and because there was no surgical techniques to do what they're doing now. So it's important, I think, that counselors understand that just because something is happening now doesn't mean it was always done that way, and it doesn't mean that it has to be done in the future. So, and then specifically, there has to be an understanding of the different protocols, the difference between Dr. Money's protocol and the protocol that came out of the Chicago Consensus out of
2006, yeah.
So I think that there has to be an understanding and importantly, there has to be an understanding in ways that are just not common knowledge of what should be, because it's basic to all of us, are the differences between the aspects or the pillars of our human sexuality, which are, we have an orientation, we have a gender identity, and we have biology. And that's not always understood, even amongst adults that have lived their whole lives. I certainly know so much more about those issues than I did when I started, than before I started, and just didn't realize how ignorant I was. So I think
I feel you there. I've been an intersex advocate for 10 years now, and I learned more stuff since February of this year than I learned in the previous 9 years. Yeah. So I'm going to interrupt you real quick and get a couple of questions in here. And where were we at? Alexander, we're going to be talking about network psychologists and how to find them in a few minutes. So if you can hang on. But Vicki, I already know how you feel on this, but Vicki would like to know how you feel about infant surgeries for intersex children.
I call myself an activist, not just an ally, because I have a very strong position that, and I think it is informed by my being a counselor, that intersex people should be given the right of autonomy and to make the determinations that impact their body for their lifetime on their own, unless, of course, it's really a medically necessary surgery. For example, there's something happening and that's preventing elimination. So there are some surgeries we all know need to be addressed for the life of the infant, but anything to do with simply sculpting the body to fit, what somebody considers to be norm for standard male men or women females is inappropriate, should be. And actually, I like Kimberly Zieselman's terminology, is illegal. In other words, she really believes that we should already be considering this is illegal, what is going on. Under our current interpretations of law, we should consider that this stuff is illegal.
I totally agree with that. And Jim wanted to chime in that he totally agrees with you about people confusing sex, gender, and sexual orientation and think they're all the same thing, and they are not. Before we move on, we were talking about the good news of intersex counseling, and I'm not sure if we covered everything we wanted to cover on that, because
Before we
you're
jump to
putting, sorry?
before we jump to that, I just sort of would like to leave the discussion about why counselors are untrained in terms of the lack of research, that umbrella,
Oh,
by
yep.
saying that there is a danger, in my view. Not only have I seen the asset of the explosion of intersex presence in the community, but I've seen from my research an explosion of research that is DSD labeled. In other words, research coming out of medical institutions. It is absolutely phenomenal, the difference between the quantity of research prior to 2014 and the amount of research now being generated by people who are very pro surgery. Why is that happening? Because
I can tell you.
why is that?
Because the Pediatric Society of Urology is supporting it, and they're paying for it.
And they're organized. They are creating a research network designed to network themselves. So they have a collaboration that this university this pediatric surgeon can collaborate with this pediatric surgeon because they're all connected with this network that is sharing subjects.
Yeah.
And it's all coming from clinic-oriented perspective. So the parents that are paying for the services are subjects that are available because they're attending the clinics. So in my mind, there is a danger if the intersex community doesn't get better organized so that counselors like myself can come in, be vetted, and get some research out that can counter the research that's coming out of the DSD clinics.
Do you have any idea what that looks like? Because I'm sitting here trying to think how I could get the intersex community to come together to even finance a study, much less do a study. I have no idea what that would look like. Do you have any idea what that might look like, or is that something we need to build on?
I do have a sense of what I think it would look like because in my nonprofit years, I learned all about membership organizations. So I very much believe that you don't have to fund the research. Counselors that are getting their degree or working for universities or students that need to establish a name, they're trying to do research articles on their own. An intersex group has to make it easy for students and professionals to connect with the intersex community to be able to write their research articles. So you don't have to do it, but you would
have to be available
and organized. I think you need to be organized like a membership organization so that your members feel like they can influence the direction of, so let's say there's a committee for intersex research and every member has a vote. And I come and say, hey, I want to do an article on intersex and aging. And you say, our priority right now is intersex surgery or something else. So you could influence the direction, of the research that you wanted to, if you had a voting organization that would say, okay, these are our priorities. And so that my sense is a membership organization of intersex people interested in mental health and interested in furthering research from researchers who don't use DSD and who are not for the surgeries.
Yeah, like Jim said, it's tough to get the intersex people to come together.
Yeah, I know.
And but it's something we got to work on. We got to figure out how to make that happen because it's important. Because pro-surgery people are getting all their stuff out there, and the anti-surgery people are getting silenced. Or being silent, probably. They're not being silenced. All right, then. So we are going to move on a bit because
I think there was a network psychologist question. Was that?
Yeah, that's where we're going next. We're going to have to talk about how to find competent mental health care providers for intersex people. Because I don't know about in New Jersey, but if I look in my insurance books that the providers have here, intersex only shows up one time, and the word right after that is surgeon. And there is no intersex mental health counselors that I can go to and say, hey, this person is competent. So how does an intersex person that needs competent mental health even begin to try and find it?
Well, I agree with you. Because there is no search term, well, there is no specific expertise in the field of counseling related to intersex. You're probably going to have to lower standards and know what your and divide your concerns into some other issues that you might find people who feel competent in. For example, trauma. I think that it is very, very traumatic for an intersex person to be grown up, to be growing up in an environment that basically tells them they do not exist. So it's very hard to develop a fundamental positive identity if you know you don't fit the only two categories there are, and the world is telling you you don't exist. That's tough. That's trauma. That's trauma. That's trauma. So you do find counselors that are very, very trained in trauma. And my personal bias is that while you may not be able to find an intersex specific individual, you probably can shop and find an open-minded individual who is very trained in trauma. And people will sometimes say they're trained in trauma, and you have to dig into their background to see if they really did spend a lot of time training trauma. Do they have names so for example, I don't have letters after my name that says I'm trained in trauma, because I'm not. So I don't consider myself the ideal counselor for an intersex individual. I would expect them to be trauma trained. Another source of possible expertise for an intersex individual is, and this particularly after maybe trauma issues have been dealt with as a priority, but as intersex people began to be interested in long-term relationships, sex therapists are very open-minded and are very versed in working with individuals who have difficulties communicating about their needs, either because they're embarrassed or their bodies aren't typical, or so they're very trained in that. And I've had intersex individuals tell me that they had the best luck with sex therapists because they were.
So if we can touch on that for a little bit, because personal experience and all that. When I first accepted the fact that I was intersex and found out that I'd had these surgeries and why I had these surgeries, I was and am still married, but it changed things for me because I was no longer comfortable with the body I have, because I realized it wasn't the body I was born with. And so, yeah, it changes that a lot. And so I would imagine for an intersex person knowing that they're intersex and coming from Intersex Island, that's what I call when you are being told you don't exist and you can only be A or B and you don't know any other intersex people. And they call it Intersex Island. So you spend this time on Intersex Island, and then you finally get comfortable with yourself, and then you think, gee, I'd like to share my life with somebody else. And that is a very, very difficult thing for a lot of intersex people, because when do you tell somebody? Do you tell somebody? And what if they beat you to death because you told them?
And that's an expertise that I think fits very well under sex therapy. You will find, because some of those issues are dealt with in a number of sexual minorities as well. So there may be some, tangential or, expertise that the counselor has that does work for the intersex individual. Not every single issue that the intersex person is faced with is only in the intersex community. And there are a lot of times an intersex person will want to go for counseling, and maybe their issue has absolutely nothing to do with them being intersex. Maybe they're having problems with their child in school. So, so there's an aspect.
Jim chimed in and he said that he was helped by 11 years of counseling with a gay certified sex therapist. So what you are saying is correct, and we have verification that it is helpful.
Yep, So trauma informed therapy, I think, is really important. Ideally, we would have a search term for intersex. Okay, that's the gold standard. But if not, I would definitely look for a counselor whose biography and history backs up the fact that they call themselves trauma informed. Are they certified? Does it look like they did internships? Does it look like they specialize in that and they spend most of their time? So you can do let me go now to how I personally would look for a counselor. If somebody came to me from another state and said, can you help me find a counselor? I'm an intersex individual. So here's what I do. So it reflects my biases. I would go onto this website, Psychology Today, and I would know that psychologists all across the nation, but not just psychologists, you'll find counselors and you'll find licensed social workers and you'll find marriage and family therapy. So this is a hub for licensed people to put themselves out in the community. And it's a pretty sophisticated, not perfect, but it's pretty sophisticated in that you can filter, you can look for things like LBGT, you can look for trauma, you can look for, so first of all, after you go onto that website, you enter your city or zip code under the section, find a therapist. And so now the database is going to return to you people who are within a certain geographic area. And you can select, okay, I'm willing to go 5 miles, I'm willing to go 10 miles, or maybe you can do, counselors who want to do distance learning. So that opens up another thing. But then you can select from a number of filters, such as, are you a mom who is looking for somebody to counsel their intersex child? Then maybe you want somebody who's specializing in childhood therapy. So you can filter by ethnicity, language, sexuality, age, also types of therapy. That's really important, and it's hard to, in a program like this, go into all the different ways that there are to provide therapy. There's the original one was the kind that Freud did, but ever since Freud, there have been so many other spin-offs, that I look for I'm assuming this is an intersex individual. I would look for trauma, and I would also probably also consider a sex therapist.
Okay, that's good to know, because.
And non-binary, by the way, I think that's another one. Not because that automatically means they're going to be trained in intersex, but they're already used to challenging the accuracy of the binary, the lies of the binary. So at least they're advanced along that level. And hopefully they would have knowledge of intersex, but at least they understand that the binary framework is false and damaging, harmful and damaging and false.
Yeah. Jim also wanted to mention that intersex people suffer a lot of trauma because they become a fetish when people find out that they're intersex. They like to either rape them or murder them, because that's the way people work in this world. If you can't understand it, you either kill it or anyway. So we're going
domestic violence. That's a good point, because although I didn't include it, domestic violence might be a way that it might be an issue that might need to be addressed. As looking for expertise. Some people have expertise, and I guess what the implication and the assumption behind what I'm saying. Let me just make real clear. A counselor who says that they're trained in every single topic and every single theory for every single age group is not telling you the truth. It's impossible. It is simply impossible. So if you can find somebody who really specializes in counseling rather than research, I'm a PhD, which means I'm more skilled in research, or I've had more training in research than I actually did one-on-one providing counseling. That's what my degree says. And that's another bias I have, is to search for PsyDs, PSYD, capital D, of in psychology. So a counselor can get their license in 3 years plus some on-site training. A psychologist and a PsyD have 7 years of training, but the PhD psychologist will be spending a lot of time doing book research, whereas the PsyD credential doesn't have to do the kind of research and will spend all of that time, that's 7 years approximately, on one-on-one counseling. So in my bias, the most trained in the helping professions are the PsyD's credential. If I was looking cold for myself, my first preference is a PsyD credential. So they just had that much more training. So whether it's anxiety, depression, trauma, they've had more years of training than and a psychiatrist has had medical training, biological training. So PsyD has focused on emotional issues their entire training.
Right. All right. Vicki asked a question, and I think it's a great question because I have white coat syndrome. Every time I go to a doctor's office, I have to take an EKG before I leave to make sure I'm not having a heart attack. And I'm still not on blood pressure medication. So it only happens in the doctor's office. Can you suggest any ideas or thoughts about how a intersex person who's had surgeries and been abused before they even knew that they were alive, and have severe issues with doctors of all kinds, how can they get over that so that they can get to the counselor?
It's a great question, a really great question. I'm not sure of any intersex individual that I interviewed that I didn't hear that there was a PTS experience around white coats.
Yeah.
So that is a barrier. And what I hope is by learning that there are specific counselors that are trained in trauma, and what that description is what is behind that is trauma. So there's a memory of trauma that's making it very difficult to go, well, there has been a lot of work in trauma. It's probably one of the areas that counseling has done the most amount of research. So if you were to be able to find a trauma therapist, and ideally, in my view, I think EMDR is one of the treatments that trauma therapists use that I think is particularly effective. There are all kinds of treatments that trauma therapists apply, and I'm not a trauma therapist, but from personal experience, and also from listening in my field, EMDR is a very good technique. That's a treatment that's being used to help people over any kind of trauma, whether it's white coat in the case of intersex or war in the case of vets. And that's why there's been a lot of research. So EMDR means eye movement. I think it's rapid desensitization, somehow like that. Don't quote me exactly what the initials mean, but basically the theory, as I understand it, is that when we have PTS, and every time we think about that bad thing, we are rehearsing it over and over and over and over. So we're like laying down a track, and that track is associated with smells and sights and experiences. So EMDR has you, as a treatment, relive that memory, but the counseling or the therapist is providing different stimulation. So in the case for me, I was in my counselor's office, and there was like a bar, like a policeman's bar, like over a police car where the lights go back and forth and back and forth. And so as I recounted my traumatic memory, I was watching that light. So the theory is that by adding a different stimulus, no longer am I digging my trench deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper every time I remember it. It's now in a different part of my brain where I wasn't actually being traumatized by it. Right. And I can tell you that, I look back after, several years, and I don't have those same thoughts that I used to have. I'm just not as frightened over some of the original trauma that I had after EMDR. So that's my personal experience with it, but there's an awful lot of research on EMDR. It's been heavily funded to support vets. So if somebody could, if somebody knows that they're afraid of white coats, and they sought through research to find a trauma certified counselor. And they said to them, I have a fear of doctors. Can you help me with that? I would hope that the knowledge that there are people who specialize in trauma and have techniques to address that and can justify that they're expert in that, explain their experiences and the success that they've had, then maybe that might give an intersex person a little bit of confidence that there's help out there so that they overcome that initial fear of, oh my gosh, how do I go back into the exact same area where I was traumatized?
Right. That's why this conversation is so important today. Just to touch on a couple of the comments in the comment section, Sheila Ann was talking about a lot of the trauma comes from parents, telling them that because they're intersex, nobody's ever going to love them or want them, and things of that nature. So yeah, the trauma is coming from all sorts of different directions. And let's see. Oh, Alexander was saying that EMDR has like a 70% success rate. Do you know if that's accurate?
I don't know the stats.
Okay. So
I don't know the stats.
70% is pretty good, considering that up until now, I figured there's nothing. So to me, that's an encouraging thing. Let's see. Insurance numbers.
Could I go back to the original statement about that? I think that one of the questions touched on what makes the intersex population's mental health issues so unique. Pillar one is that, for me, is that there's prejudice, in so many different forms. But what makes the prejudice against intersex people unique is that if I'm an African American and I'm receiving prejudice, I'm not invisible. I'm not told I don't exist. I'm just told I'm inferior. Yeah. So every other thing, you actually exist, but intersex people are told they don't even exist. So how do they slot as they're developing their identity? How do they slot the differences they feel when they don't fit what's supposed to happen according to the division of everything into male and female? That's really hard to develop a positive identity if you don't exist. And then, what was I going to say second? Oh, and the very people so pillar number 2 for me in terms of identity development for intersex individuals is that as we develop trust in identity, intersex people have been harmed by the very people, the most trusted people in society that are supposed to protect them, the medical profession and their parents. So now if trust is such an important part of healthy identity, an intersex individual, in order to reach out to get help, has to somehow have enough identity that they can come up over the so-called authorities of our society and challenge the binary and challenge their parents without at the same time saying, I never want to have anything to do with society again because it's all a lie and parents can never be good and doctors can never be good. I mean, the challenge to develop a healthy identity when it's your very authorities, that have hurt you is a formidable identity challenge. And my counseling field needs to know that so that they can come in informed about those two things.
Yeah, I can attest to that because when I found out about this, it totally destroyed my belief in my religion, my belief in my parents, my belief in the medical society, and my belief in humanity as a whole. And it just totally destroyed everything. And suddenly anything and everything was an option. And that got me into trouble too. But so before we go on, where did that go? Oh, there we go. Julia asks, asking out of the Ukraine, and is wondering if you have worked with a lot of intersex people, or is your research purely theoretical? Because in the Ukraine, they have LGBTI psychologists, but they don't know who the intersex people are, so they really don't have patients.
So counselors are kind of a hybrid. Our research So my PhD research was based upon interviewing activists, a small number of activists, because my research was qualitative. But so I worked with actual people to develop the identity work around intersex mental health that I did. So I think that's the answer to the question.
All right. So you have worked with intersex people and you are a researcher. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So Jim made an interesting comment. The world-renowned sexologist, Dr. Anka Einhart, told him and his parents in the early 70s that he was nothing. And that's from a sexologist that said that Jim was nothing. And that's like, wow, not only do you not exist, you're just nothing. That's horrible.
By the way, Anka Earhart was a co-author with Dr. Money. So,
that explains a lot.
And the last I looked into this, which was just a couple of years ago, she remains in practice and working with a university in New York.
All right. So we are getting pressed for time. So as much as I'd like to continue this for the next hour, because I bet we could really put another hour into this if we weren't careful. But anytime I have a mental health professional on, I think it's important to provide some immediate resources if anybody that's watching this show is having, I don't want to, suicidal thoughts or bad thoughts, or you're just in a really bad place. There are places that you can get help today. And we want to put those up on the screen. The Trevor Project, thetrevorproject.org/get-help-now. It's a difficult one, but the tretvorproject.org/get-help-now. And then is the Sage LGBT Elder Hotline. If you're experiencing elder abuse or you're one of the seniors of our population, that is a great resource. The Sage LGBT Elder Hotline and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Sometimes not always the best place for an intersex person to go, but the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 800-273-8255. 800-273-8255.
By the way, Jess, with that hotline and with this hotline, you can ask when you get on and say, are you LGBT or intersex affirming? You can qualify them and say, so with the Trevor Project, you already know that they're affirming, and the same thing with an LGBT Sage hotline, you know that they're affirming. But with these national hotlines, you could get somebody who's not affirming, but you could ask for make sure you qualify and that they are affirming. So.
Oh, that's good to know. So you can, like, maybe you're not the person I need to talk to because I need somebody that is this.
Affirming.
Yep, there you go. I like that. Also, suffer a lot of sexual abuse in the intersex community. So the National Sexual Assault Hotline, again, another one where you're going to want to qualify the person as being affirming of the LGBTQIA society. Their number is 1-800-656-HOPE, 656-HOPE, the National Sexual Assault Hotline. And do we have one more, Bosch, or are we done? We're done. All right. So now, Dr. Mulit, right? Mulit. All right. You were featured in a blog article on the Manello College, excuse me, I keep on saying university, blog. And we're going to put a link to that in the comments because then you can actually click on it. We might be doing it within the last 10 minutes of the show ending or not. But I was reading that and I thought it was very interesting because it always gives me a chance to talk to you about you. And apparently you were a wild child growing up.
I definitely think I challenged a lot of my teachers and certainly my parents and siblings as well. So yes, yeah.
So going against the system has kind of been your
I
MO
think
through life. And
every,
I appreciate that you're doing it at this point, and doing it for the intersex people, because there could be so many other things that you could pour your energies into. I want you to know, as an intersex person, I appreciate all that you have done to help us and to educate others so that they can help us as well, because it's so important to get mental health for intersex people and lift them up and support them so that they feel strong enough to come out and talk about their story.
yes.
All right. We are running a little bit past the hour, but I do want to find out how people can get a hold of you if they are a counselor, because you're not necessarily here to provide mental health for intersex people. But if there are counselors out there that would like to get a hold of you so that they can learn more and educate themselves so that they can be better, how would they get a hold of you?
My email is the best way to reach me, and it's my name with a period in between. So it's cynthia.mulit@me.com.
Oh, see, that's why I can't
That's right.
pronounce your name. There you go. I missed a letter in your name. That explains why I've had so much trouble. Anyway, there's a whole lot more I want to go into, but we're running past our time here, and I don't want to hold people up when they probably have other things that they need to do. I do want to thank you so, so much for all the work that you've done and for making intersex counseling a thing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I shout out to some of the activists that I saw by virtue of their questions. I'm not aware of who actually is on this, but I did see by some of the questions, some of the activists that have done so much. Jim and Vicky have been so instrumental in helping others understand the challenges that intersex people have, and yourself. So there would be no way that somebody like myself who cares could try to do something if there weren't very brave activists who are so brave that they are reaching out to others through their own trauma. So this work leaves me on a daily basis in awe of people like yourselves and others who are writing memoirs. It's just if somebody were to ask me, if you want to be impressed with humanity, where do I go? And I would say, look up Intersex Activists. I am humbled by their courage every single day.
I appreciate you saying that, because being an intersex activist is a very lonely, difficult job, and it doesn't pay at all. And so it pays in by your kind comments and the kind comments of other people that support us. So I really do appreciate you saying that. And we got all sorts of comments thanking you for the conversation and your hard work. And
hey, Allison, congratulations.
Yeah, huh?
LCSW in 2 years. Woo! Specialize in intersex.
Yeah, that. Amen. Specialize in intersex and hang up a shingle that says intersex so everybody knows you're there.
In every state. We need counselors in every state, or
Yes,
specialists in every state.
State, country, everywhere.
Yes.
All over the world. There's 139 million intersex people and you. So we're all going to call you up later today and have a chat. No. Can you handle 139 million of us? All right.
I'm working on cloning myself.
There you go. All right. Dr. Mulit, thank you so much. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you being here, how much I appreciate the work that you're doing. Keep up the good work, and thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And thank you for all you and Vosh are doing. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's truly amazing. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.